Hi everyone, Jason here. I'm one of the pastors at Compassion Church. Thank you for joining me. I pray that this teaching blesses you. You know, we've been going through the book of Galatians. If you haven't read or listened to those, go back the last few weeks and click those if you will. Throughout the book of Galatians that we've been reading, Paul's been making a compelling argument. He's been making the argument that Christians should not be submitted under the law or the old law of righteousness, but that we should be submitted to grace. In other words, we should be not legalistic Christians, but spiritual ones that are led by the Spirit. And we're going to talk about Galatians chapter 4 tonight. We're going to really dig in about halfway through the chapter, but I want to set this lesson up for you. I want to set up where we're going, and hopefully we'll end up in somewhere where it gives us a few answers. I think you need to watch next week to get the full answer. But Romans 10:4 says, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. One of the basic tenets of Christianity is this, that we're no longer bound by the Old Testament laws and ordinances. We walk in forgiveness. We walk in grace. We are free from it because Christ has fulfilled the law. We are no longer a slave to the law. We're no longer bound by the list of the rules of do's and do nots. The reason is if we're going to be bound by the list of do's and do nots throughout the Old Testament, then we have to be bound to what? The stiff penalties, which include eternal judgment. We're free. We're free from that. We don't have to have judgment over our head. We don't have to have shame following us everywhere. We are forgiven. We are redeemed. We are transformed and changed. Now, this creates a tension in church. I see it all the time. I see it every week. And what happens is this, is we know that what? We are still to pursue righteousness. We pursue it through the Spirit. It should still be our goal. But here's the thing. The law does it externally. Grace does it internally. When you submit yourself to the do's and do nots, when you submit yourself to the law, what you're submitting yourself is to be judged by your actions, by your external actions. What did you do? What did you not do? And if you failed, not only are you guilty, but according to the law of Moses, you're guilty of the entire thing. However, if it's internal, if it's by the Spirit, then God is changing us by His grace day by day. Not that we don't ever fail, but we receive forgiveness in that. And that through sanctification, we're being changed, constantly transformed into the likeness of Christ. So that what? That we can follow a list of do's and do nots? Absolutely not. So that we can live righteously because He's transformed us from the inside. And it's the behavior that we want to pursue. It's the behavior, the way we want to live, because not just that we want to live pleasing to God, but that we want to live like Him, because He's changing our nature. He's changing who we are. We don't want to just do things, but we want to be. We want to not just do different, we want to be different. And that's the awesome thing about grace, is that following Jesus makes our difference, or makes a difference in our lives, makes every difference. Listen to this. However, this tension creates a problem. We believers start looking at people who what? Don't look like believers. What do I mean by that? They don't look the way we think they should. They don't do the things we think they should. They might even sin. And because of that, I don't know if they're a believer. So we start what? We start making up our own rules, our own mind's eye. We start making images of what a Christian looks like, or what a believer looks like. And we start saying when people violate those rules that we make, well, they're not a real believer. They don't really look like a Christian. They don't really act like a Christian. We're in a struggle. We're in that tension where we think a believer should be something different than what we're seeing. But what have we done? We're setting up the law again. It might not be the law of Moses, but we're setting up do's and do nots of what we think a believer should be. We're doing the same thing. We're going back to the Old Testament. Paul's going to address this in Galatians 4. We're going back to the Old Testament by a different route. We're going back to our old ways of thinking by saying, this is what righteousness should look like. And if you're not that, then you're not saved. You're not Christian. You're not living like a believer should live. So what's the answer to all this? We know that God has a righteous standard, that he wants to place that righteous standard in us. He wants us to live it. He wants us to be a part of it, but yet we're not to live under the list of do's and do nots. How do we spell out rules of righteousness so that they're not being abused? Short answer is this: we don't. It's not our job. It's God's job. It's God's job. Stop judging people based on righteousness. Stop judging people based on what they do and don't do. It's not our job. I'm not saying that we shouldn't live righteously, but quit looking at people and say, well, they don't live the way I think they should, and condemning them, because it's the very thing Jesus came to erase. The law judges by the external. In other words, the law looks at what you do and don't do, and when you do or don't do the right thing, it not only declares you guilty, it declares you guilty of the entire law. Once you've said a lie, you're guilty. Once you've hated someone, you're guilty. Once you've lusted after someone, you're guilty. Once you've done one little thing wrong, you are guilty. God's righteousness must come from the internal. In other words, grace says, look, I'm going to forgive you of your sins. I'm going to wipe them away. Not only are you not guilty of them, they're no longer a part of you. And the goal of grace is to change you from the inside out. It's not to give you a list of do's and don'ts to make you look righteous. Grace's goal is to make you righteous. And so by transforming us from the inside out, Christ doesn't just give us, well, this is what righteousness is, or this is what righteousness is not. What he does is he gives us a desire for the righteousness of God. He gives us a desire to walk in it. We begin to gain knowledge from him about what it is. Not just what it is, but that's what we want. You don't have to have a list of do's and do nots if you're following Jesus, because you'll just want to do it. It'll be part of who you are. You don't have to be told not to murder, because murder is not in your heart. You don't have to be told not to lie, because lying is not in your heart. And you say, well, I haven't gotten there. I know. Me neither. But that's the great thing about grace, is he's taking me there. And that's the thing the believers, and what Paul is trying to get through us here in Galatians, that we need to grasp, is that yes, you're not there yet, but living grace, you will get there. But if you go back to the law, if you go back to the list of do's and do nots, it will tear you down. It will destroy you. It will eat you alive. So as we get halfway through Galatians, we're going to see that Paul has, Galatians chapter 4, we're going to see that Paul has shifted from writing to Jews to writing to Gentiles who are in the same church. And what we're going to find is they've got the same issue the Jews do. There's just a little twist on it. There's a little twist. And now I say Jews, they're all Christians. Jews, Gentiles, they're all Christians, but their backgrounds coming into the church are different. But they're all suffering from the same issue. False teachers are trying to set them up under laws of works, and they're taking them backwards away from Christianity. So, as he begins chapter 4, he's talking to the Jews and he tells them, look, you were once slaves. That's what the law did to you. It made you slaves. But the awesome thing about Jesus is he came and he made us children. So if you're children, you get all kinds of benefits from being children. Obviously, I think everyone listening to me knows that a child has a benefit that a slave does not. A slave is to what? Do or do not. What's going on the inside doesn't matter. What's going on in the heart doesn't matter. If you're a slave, you do what you're told, and you do it unquestioningly. And that's what Paul says. You were under the law. When you were under the law, you were a slave. You do it unquestioningly, and you do it like you're supposed to. Of course, we know that we can't, but he's telling them that children are what? Children are in relationship. Children get an inheritance. Children get trained up. Children get transformed. Children get taught. Children get corrected. But children have a relationship that's not broken that way. A slave can be, I hate to be so callous, a slave can be sold, given away, or just cast out. But a child, no. Child has a relationship. Child's part of the heart. A child gets inheritance. A child is the next generation of the family. Now with God, we're his children. What does that mean? That means we're going to get an inheritance from him. That means he's got something for us. It also means we're in a relationship with him. In Galatians 4:8, he turns his attention to the Gentiles. Now when I say Gentiles in the context of what we're talking about today, I'm not just talking about those who are excluded from the faith in Judaism. That's usually what it means. It usually means a non-Jew in Scripture. It means somebody who's not part of God's family because they're not a Jew. What it means here is they have a Gentile background. All these people are part of the same family. Jew, Gentile, doesn't matter because they're all believers. They're all Christians. But when I say Gentile, he's talking to Gentile Christians. In other words, those believers with Gentile backgrounds, not Jewish backgrounds. So now he's speaking to Christians, but he's speaking to the non-Jewish ones. And in Galatians chapter 4, verse 8 through 12, he says this: before you Gentiles, again, Christians, knew God, you were slaves to so-called gods that don't even exist. So now you know God, or should I say, now God knows you. Why do you want to go back again and become slaves once more to weak and useless spiritual principles of this world? You are trying to earn favor with God by observing certain days or months or seasons or years. I fear for you. Perhaps all my hard work with you was for nothing. Dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to live as I do in freedom from these things. Freedom from what things? Let's go back. Freedom from observing certain days, months, seasons, years. Spiritual principles of this world. What's he talking about? He's talking about works. We'll get to more of that in a second. Dear brothers, I plead with you to live as I do in freedom from these things. For I have become like you Gentiles, free from those laws. Galatia was part of the Roman Empire. They adopted Greco-Roman culture. So over time, they had really integrated themselves into Greco-Roman culture because the Greeks and the Romans were such a strong influence in this area. Now, I think it's part of Turkey today, but at the time, they had adopted these Greco-Roman things, including what? Their religions. So Paul's addressing them here as what is the Greeks or other Gentiles in that region? Now, he points out the gods they used to serve, what? The gods they used to serve not only had no power, but they weren't even real. They weren't even gods. You can give them names. You can say they're up in the sky. They don't exist. They're not real. That idol sitting on their hearth at home means nothing. It's a piece of wood. It's a piece of iron. It's nothing. It has no power. Golly, guys, we do that in the church, don't we? We do it in the church. I don't just mean all the pagan things we play with sometimes, but let's get down to brass tacks a little bit. Let's talk about false idols. We get frustrated, we get stressed, we get anxious, or we fall into sin. What do believers do? We so easily go back to the previous life, to previous things that made us feel comfortable. A simple example, I know all y'all don't struggle with this, but an alcoholic, even after he might get saved, he might struggle with it. What happens when he gets stressed, anxious, or pressed? He goes back to what? Back to drinking. You don't think that drinking's an idol? You think it's just a bad habit? You think it's just you think it's just a psychological issue? It's an idol. It's an idol because he's going to it for comfort. And we do the same thing in the church. So our gods might not be Zeus, Hermes, or Mercury like it was for these guys. So we might not be going back to Zeus. We might not be going back to Mercury, but we go back to our old habits. We go to those things that give us comfort. We go to the things in our past that didn't work before, but it's where we're comfortable. Man, isn't that a terrible thing for anybody? Anybody. Why go back? Paul said, why go back to those things that you know don't work? He tells them you're going through old rituals. Why do you want to go back to the weak and useless spiritual principles of this world? We do the same thing. What old habit that you have that you know is not of God, but when you're pressed, that's what you go to? I don't care what it is. What happens when you're stressed and you do stressed eating? Anybody do stressed eating out there? You get hurt, and what do? You go to a pint of ice cream? I love you, but that's an idol because you're going to it for comfort. Look, we live in grace, so don't feel like I'm condemning you. I'm showing you how, if we do those things, we're in slavery to it. I have my own issues. I have my own things that when I'm pressed and I get stressed and I've got my head and my hand disease. I have things habits that I go back to, things that I look for answers, stress reliefs. You know what I mean? But before Jesus, they worshiped Zeus, Hermes, and other mythological gods. And the key to this is this, though. This is the thing. This is the thing. When we go back to these old idols, we're trying to appease what? We're trying to appease our situation. It is a form of works. It is a form of works. Listen to me. When in Roman and Greek mythology, what mankind would have to do was do good works. And some of them worked, some of them didn't. But they'd have to do good work to try to appease the God's anger, to try to appease their whims. So if something bad was happening in your life, tell me if this sounds familiar. Something bad's happening in your life, well, in their case, the gods aren't pleased with me. Gods aren't pleased with me. I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to try to appease them. I know we never do that. Believers don't do that, right? Do you see a trend here? Something bad happens in your life, do you blame it on what's going on with God? And then what do? Instead of really being repentant for your sin, you might have tears, but you're sorry for it. But you're not really repentant. So you get in this cycle of going back to the sin, being sorry for it, going back to the sin, being sorry for it, going back to the sin, being sorry for it, and then something bad happens, and you're like, oh, God's mad at me. God's angry at me. Broken, sinful man is always compelled in his flesh nature to try to impress God with his good works. But it's a terribly vicious cycle. Because here's what happens. We sin. We're sorrowful, not repentant. Repentance comes through grace. We're sorrowful. Then we try to impress God with doing good works. Bad things happen. We think that we made him mad, that he's upset with us. And what do? We sin again, and we go in this cycle. That's what the Gentiles here were doing in the church of Galatia. They were getting back under works, do's and do-nots. They messed up. They would go back to try to appeasing gods like Zeus and Hermes. They said, they're upset with us. They're upset with us because we did the wrong thing. He said, why did they do this? Well, they had false teachers telling them this. They had false teachers leading them away. Paul's distressed here. He's like, you have been freed by grace. Why would you listen to these false teachers? But these false teachers are telling them, the gods are not pleased with you, and they go back to their legalistic, unlawful laws and their works way of thinking. So the Jewish believers in the church of Galatia were trying to follow religious Mosaic rules. You starting to see something here? Are you seeing this with me? The Jewish Christians are saying, that's not the God we know. He has all these rules. So they start trying to live the Mosaic rules because they know what? That came from the one true God. So they start trying to legalistically live. Say, that's not what a Christian should look like. Are you with me? That's not what a Christian should look like. So we got these laws of Moses over here, and then you got the Gentile Christians over here in the same church saying, well, I messed up, but you know, your Moses rules aren't working for me, so I've got to go back to Zeus. I've got to go back to getting in these legalistic law ways of living that are death, that are not good, and they're not living by the Spirit. I see it in the church today, guys. I do. Some of us have a way of thinking, well, this is how Christians should be. But when somebody's struggling and doesn't maybe know Jesus as much as a mature believer, they need grace. They need love. They need help in walking that out. So how do we break this cycle? How do we break this cycle and truly live in good works? What? That God has created for us and that are spiritually led. How? You know He has good works. The Bible tells us that He has good works that He made before us, before the foundation of the world. How do we do that and not be legalistic? It's on the inside. It's on the inside. Galatians 4:21. Now, next week, tune in for chapter 5 because that really goes in depth on what goes on the inside being a Spirit-led believer. But we're just going to touch on it tonight. Galatians chapter 4, verse 21, Paul says, Tell me you who want to live under the law. In other words, tell me who you want to make these rules, these tenets of what a Christian should look like. Tell me, those of you who want to do that, who want to make an impersonal, legalistic rule list, tell me those who you want to live under the law, do you know what the law actually says? Paul tells us this: Abraham had 2 sons. He did. Those of you who know the story, you know he had 2 sons. He had 2 sons. One was Ishmael, one was Isaac. There was one that Ishmael tried to force into existence when he didn't think God's promise was coming, when he didn't think God was going to deliver. Excuse me, scratching my nose. When he didn't think it was going to happen, what? He tried to force it by having a son with his slave. And that son was Ishmael. That is representing living under the old covenant, living under legalism. Why? Because it's one that Ishmael was born of a human attempt to reach the gift of the Spirit rather than letting God bring you there. Ishmael, God had given Abraham a promise. God would deliver on the promise. God was delayed in the promise in Abraham's mind. And because of that, Abraham was going to make a human attempt to make a God thing happen. That, my friends, is living under the law. The human attempt to make a God thing happen. However, the other one, this is the difference between religion and relationship. This is the difference between religion and relationship. These sons both represent the covenants that God has given. Ishmael, the old covenant. But what happens when you live under the old covenant? It's about religion. It's about doing. It's about making things happen in a human attempt to impress God. What happens when you don't do the doing or the do of the old covenant? Guilt, shame, condemnation, and punishment. But the second son, Isaac, represented the new covenant. He represented the covenant of grace that we have under Jesus Christ. Isaac was God's delivering of the promise that God had made. And therefore, Isaac brought with him what? He brought with him blessing, future, and hope. Isaac happened because God intervened. That's grace. That is the new covenant. Righteousness is not going to happen because you do it. True righteousness, true holy living, true goodness, true blessing, true everything that God has for you under the new covenant is going to happen because God does it. The new covenant's like the second son, Isaac. It's about relationship. It's not about you doing for God. It's about God, what God has done for you. What happens when you don't do the do in the new covenant? Forgiveness, restoration, correction, and freedom. I don't know about you, but that's the covenant I want to live under. How do we get out of the cycle? Guys, it's all about relationship. It's all about relationship. I can promise you from Scripture and from experience, if you're not living in relationship with Jesus right now, if you're not spending time with Him, if you're not spending time in His Word to learn about Him, to learn about who He is, about what He's speaking to you, if you're not spending in time in prayer, listening to Him in the internal spirit, whether you're living like the Gentiles in chapter 4 or you're living like the Jews earlier in Galatians, you're living a life of works. You're living a life that's trying to appease God. You try to do the right thing, but when you don't, you just beat the snot out of yourself, or worse yet, you've gotten so far away that you don't care. It's the relationship. The relationship with Jesus is everything. What is the answer to the tension I was talking about earlier? It's spending time with Jesus and allowing Him to change you from the inside out. You don't have to worry about the law. You don't have to worry about rules of righteousness because He will live them through you. He He will fulfill what He fulfilled in you. God bless you. I hope you have an awesome day, evening, morning, whenever you're listening to this.